If you already understand that Governor Inslee's Climate Commitment Act is a complete sham that is needlessly hurting working class people, then this segment is not to convince you of anything because you already know that to be true. What this segment is for, and who I want to speak to, are people who might not mind that gas prices have gone way up since the beginning of the year. Are people who might not mind that their budgets are stretched a little thinner because they care about the environment and they believe the governor when he says that ultimately the impact is going to be a better environment for you and for your kids. So that's who I want to talk to today, because if you believe that, it's not true. It's not true. And the example that I'm going to give you today, I hope can help you begin to understand that. You know, we've already seen all these examples of climate goals that the governor has set that he never met. And he knew he wasn't meeting because the government website meant to track those goals on things around recycling and carbon emissions, scrub the goals, hid that information so it was harder for people who do care about environmental outcomes to see what was happening. So we already know that the governor has a failed track record on environmental issues. And I, for one, care about the environment, and it's not enough for me to just see someone talking about it. You know, I can say, oh, I'm going to do all these things for the environment. If I don't actually do those things for the environment and I spend billions of dollars for nothing, am I really an environmentalist? Am I really the climate governor or the climate presidential candidate? I would argue no. So there is a specific line item for all this money coming in through the Climate Commitment Act, $2.2 billion so far, way more than they ever thought would come in from these carbon auctions. There's a line item that was $70 million. And what they used that $70 million to do is to buy out, essentially, shut down a working forest in Washington owned by the state. What's interesting about this particular line item is it's actually an agreed upon fact that using that $70 million to shut down this working forest will be a net negative for the environment. Experts on both sides agree with this. Experts with the state of Washington, experts in the private sector, and the Commissioner of Public Lands, Hillary Franz, a Democrat, a progressive Democrat, does not believe that this will help the environment, but it's being done anyway. So to talk more about this, I wanted to bring in Heath Heikkila. He is the Director of Government Affairs of the American Forest Resource Council, and he is trying to raise alarm bells over all of this. How did this come to your attention?
Yeah, thanks. So last session, late in the session as they were working on budgets, they actually inserted $70 million in CCA funds into the capital budget to stop timber harvesting on 2,000 acres of Department of Natural Resources state trust lands. These are lands that are managed under strict environmental regulations to produce Washington-grown wood products and generate non-tax revenue for schools and things like fire departments and other public services, while also providing for wildlife habitat and the other things we like from our forests.
Okay, so if that's CCA money, then I have to imagine that doing that and spending $70 million on it has a benefit to the environment, because that's the goal, right? So what's the climate benefit to doing that?
Well, unfortunately, there is no climate benefit from it. And in fact, I would argue that it's a climate negative. And, folks like Todd Myers over at the Washington Policy Center, as well as case studies that have been done looking at this. What happens is simply we end up importing our wood products from other countries with transportation related emissions, or from countries that don't have the environmental protections that we do, or we use materials that actually take more energy and therefore emit more carbon to produce them. We substitute those for those wood products.
Well, let's back up then. What is the claimed climate benefit from shutting down that working forest?
Well, they would claim that simply by walking away from that forest, that somehow that carbon will be stored forever and that these forests will continue to store carbon. That's not supported by the science, though. When you look at it, an older forest, an old growth forest, it certainly stores a lot of carbon, but it is actually not sequestering or pulling down carbon at the same rate that a younger, healthy, growing forest is. And we also know here in the Northwest, more and more these years, what a risk wildfires are. And those older stands are more susceptible to insects, disease, and wildfires, which then have huge carbon emissions associated with them.
Why would they be convinced to believe that spending $70 million to shut down this working forest would somehow benefit the environment?
Well, sometimes in Olympia, things are about politics more than they are necessarily about, science or facts. The reality is there is definitely a growing movement of kind of anti-forestry activism, particularly within the Democrat Party, that drove for this budget proviso to be included.
One of the things that's interesting here, though, is I think it might be easier for kind of the pro-CCA crowd to dismiss me saying that, to dismiss you saying that, to dismiss Todd Myers saying that. But I mean, Hillary Franz, a Democrat, a commissioner of public lands, she's in agreement, is she not?
Yes, well, in a recent speech that she gave, she essentially outlined that when you look at it, whether it's the science or it's the economics or just the social implications of managing these forests, that the folks that are really trying to shut down these forests are just wrong on the facts.
Those who want to stop timber production and forest management are wrong. They're dead wrong. They're wrong on the climate science. They're wrong on the economics, and they're wrong on the impacts to our state and our environment.
And actually, officials from the Department of Natural Resources career staff who were brought before the legislature to provide an update on this budget item just this past December also commented after questioning from committee members that this will not help our climate and there were better ways to spend these CCA dollars if our goal was to reduce carbon emissions.
And so
for what it cost you to purchase 1 acre of timber, you could have planted 20 acres of burned over ground. Would you sequester more carbon by reforesting 20 acres than you would setting aside 1 acre of carbon dense forest and sending it to old growth?
Acquiring lands that are risk of conversion is going to do more, I think, for that carbon benefit than setting aside forests, than potentially even doing reforestation. Because again, once that land is now no longer forest land, it stops. It is not going to sequester any more carbon.
And one of the ways they pointed out, because you had referenced it a little bit earlier, is helping prevent forest fires. So what could we do with that $70 million that would be better suited to actually have positive climate outcomes?
Well, we could be thinning our forests to reduce the risk of catastrophic wildfires, which is in many states is becoming the largest source of carbon emissions here in the West as more and more forests burn. Or we could have put that money towards reforesting acres that had burned, where you're actually going back in and putting those trees back on the landscape so they are once again sequestering carbon.
Do you have is there any inclination that given what DNR said, given what Hillary Franz has said, and some of the evidence that you just laid out and some of the possible alternatives, that they might back away from this particular line item?
Well, no, I think the folks, the activists who pressed so hard for this last session are actually actively working again to try to get another amount of CCA dollars in these budgets to set aside additional acres. So I don't know what the legislature will do this time, but I don't think it's the best look for the CCA and spending these dollars. Our forests have a tremendous opportunity, frankly, to be a climate solution, but when you're promoting the wrong policies that are actually going to cause more environmental harm elsewhere, it makes no sense, particularly when you look here in Washington. Many people don't realize half of our forest lands we've set aside from any kind of timber management, and that's to do the right thing for wildlife habitat and other things. So we've really struck a balance here in this state with natural resources and forest management, but all we're going to do is export our demand to places that don't have that balance.
Yeah, these kind of conversations can come across as like insider baseball. It's a forest issue, like $70 million. And sometimes I personally struggle with how to make people realize that if, for instance, I'm opposed personally to the CCA in its current form. I don't believe that we have to have environmental policies that hurt working class people in that way at the gas pump. But, the retort and what the governor has said and Democrats have said is, if you're opposed to it, you hate the environment. Like, that's it. You hate the environment, you want the earth to end in a fiery blaze or whatever it is. So how do we begin to push back against that narrative that if you have questions about the CCA, how the money is spent, about the increase to gas prices, that you just are like a climate change denier?
Well, I always think, Brandi, where does the root word of conservation come from? It comes from conservative, and it's essentially making those choices we all do, and really to care for the environment, which we do in this state and this country, really better than any other place in the world. So I think we have a lot to be proud of in terms of what we're doing. And in most cases, that comes down to, individuals wanting to do the right thing rather than necessarily being coerced to do so.
Yeah, and I want to just end with something that isn't, like, I guess, climate related, so to speak, but is maybe an impact. If you have the $70 million designed to shut down a working forest, are we losing jobs?
Well, yes, absolutely. This has a pretty significant impact, probably about $180 million economic impact of negative economic impact. We are losing revenue, that revenue I mentioned earlier, to go to school construction, to libraries, fire districts, et cetera. And then meanwhile, we're importing, frankly, more of our wood products. The amount of wood that we're talking about here is enough to frame about 9,000 homes. So this is at the same time we're having an affordable housing crisis in this state. These are the kinds of decisions this policy, has.
Yeah, it's not as if for the whole, don't cut down trees crowd. It's not as if some trees aren't still going to cut down. I mean, we're still building these things. We still need those materials. And as you point out, we're just getting them from somewhere else in ways that are going to put way more carbon out into the atmosphere. It's costing us jobs. It's this kind of policy making and this sort of decision making. It really makes me scratch my head. How the people who make these decisions are in any sort of position of power. Heath, we really appreciate it. Keep your eye on the rest of that CCA spending for us, okay?
I'll do my best. Thanks, Brandi. Thanks for your work.
Again, that's Heath Heikkila. He's the Director of Government Affairs of the American Forest Resource Council. We appreciate his time and his expertise. But again, I would speak to people who support the Climate Commitment Act. Do you support this $70 million spend? If the answer is no, do you also support taking a closer look at the other $2.2 billion that are being spent from the revenue that, again, is coming from Washingtonians at the gas pump? Because I promise you that this $70 million isn't the only thing that is going to a program that we're supposed to believe is going to help the environment, that it will actually have a net negative impact on the environment. It is not just coming from me. It's not just coming from Heath. It's not just coming from the Washington Policy Center, a conservative think tank. It is coming from DNR. It is coming from the Washington State Department of Natural Resources, which had to admit under questioning that this would not have a benefit on the environment and on carbon sequestration, and that you'd get much more of that if you manage the forests that we have that are susceptible to wildfires. The benefits would be far greater. It's coming from Hillary Franz, who's running for Congress, a Democrat, was running for governor, is the current commissioner of public lands, a progressive Democrat who knows this stuff and who understands that people who believe that spending $70 million to shut down operations on a 2,000-acre working forest because they think that's going to help the environment are dead wrong.